This review is for The Art of Pirates of the Caribbean, published in 2007, and it covers the first 3 Pirates movies. So the very first thing to point out about this book is the sheer size. For comparison, here's another book that's roughly, US letter A4 size, so you can see just how big this book is. Format-wise, it is easily the largest art book I've ever seen for a movie. In terms of length, it runs about 160 pages, which is very standard for an art book, although that does feel very short considering this is 3 movies. When I got to the end of the Black Pearl section, I was sort of like, wait, that's it? So there's not actually a ton of art in this book considering that it's 3 movies. What this book really feels like to me is almost like a fine art exhibition catalogue, almost as if there was an art museum that ran a Pirates of the Caribbean exhibit, and this was the catalogue of the exhibits. And it gives that impression for 2 reasons. One, everything is printed so large, often you'll get 1 image per page or sometimes 1 image per spread, and you sometimes get that feeling of, hey, they could have fit 4 or 5 images on this page rather than just 1 black and white portrait, which sometimes does feel a little disappointing, but it does lend itself to this idea that everything sort of feels like it's given its own space. It feels like a real showcase. And then the second reason is that from a technical standpoint, the artwork presented in here is some of the finest, most technically impressive concept art created for a movie. I really enjoyed how the book doesn't feature a lot of the sort of vague, sketchy digital art that typifies most concept art. The level of detail and technical skill shown in a lot of these images is really breathtaking, almost like you could expect to see them in a fine arts museum. And so from that point of view, having them displayed in this book in such a large format actually makes a whole lot of sense. It's really hard to communicate through a video the impact the images in this book have from being printed so large. It just has a lot of those moments when you turn the page and you're sort of like, wow, and your eyes sort of widen. And I found myself sort of poring over the details of each picture a lot more than I would for an art book printed at a normal size. So from a kind of objective point of view, as a fan of art books in general, this book is so impressive and so overwhelming. However, from my personal point of view, as a huge fan of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, I was a little bit underwhelmed by the contents, and I say that for 2 reasons. One, as I mentioned, there's not a ton of art per movie in this book, and 2, the actual tone of the art that's reflected in the book is, like I said, very fine and impressive, but also demands a sort of reverence or austerity, a real moodiness that you don't find in the actual movies, which are very fun, which is not something that is necessarily captured very well in this book. In fact, there are so many points when going through this book, you forget that you're actually looking at a book on the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. It almost feels like, when I was talking about this being an exhibit catalogue, almost like it was an exhibit on 20th century pirate art. So with the exception of a lot of the fantasy elements, like the crew of the Flying Dutchman or the Black Pearl crew, there's not actually a whole lot that really gives a sense of Pirates of the Caribbean, the movie. Also, talking about the tone and style of the art, I don't think this is necessarily a criticism of the book, but perhaps more of the art direction for the movie. But visually, I was really hoping the book would take a lot more advantage of its location, a lot more sort of tropical, colourful, exotic looking art, and there's really not a lot of that. Even when they show pictures of Port Royal or other Caribbean islands, they also have this real sort of moodiness, lots of cloud coverage, not really bright and colourful the way I was kind of hoping for, because we see so many concept art books that deal with cities or the future or other sort of more dark, moody locales. So I was really hoping for concept art from a non-animated movie to show a more exotic, vibrant style. It actually reminds me a lot of why I was a little disappointed with the Assassin's Creed 4 art book, which, if you're not familiar, is also a pirate related. It also had a lot of sort of more dark, moody visuals, rather than taking advantage of the sort of tropical visuals that are actually apparent both in that game and in these movies. Also, there's almost no text in the book. There's an introduction by director Gore Verbinski, and then an afterword, and then each of the images is labeled including the artist who produced the image, which is always really great to see. But other than that, there's no text. And so it is a little bit of a shame that there's no text or comments on the actual concept art. One of my favourite parts was that in the introduction, Gore Verbinski talks about how the story they were creating influenced the art, and then the art they were creating influenced the story. That sort of really great creative process that is producing producing concept art. And so as a fan, it's really cool to not only see the things that they took from these pieces to include in the movies, but also seeing tons of details for things that they didn't include is always really great fun. One other great thing about this book is that I could absolutely recommend to someone that doesn't necessarily really like the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. You don't have to be a fan to enjoy this book. If you're just a fan of the sort of art that's presented in here, then this is the sort of book that you can really enjoy, even if you're not a fan of the movies. And admittedly, I actually didn't want to like this book as much as I ended up doing, just because I had read so many really positive reviews about it, and I was sort of just thinking, ho ho ho, these simpletons are being blinded by the extravagance of the book, which actually is often the case with a lot of books. So many large, fancy, impressive books that are ultimately all style and no substance actually almost always get really positive reviews. But in this case, I was absolutely pleasantly surprised to see that the content really does live up to the sort of fancy presentation of the book, which is really nice. And as I was going through this book, I always just kept coming back to this idea of the size of the book, because even though it does undeniably add something extra to the experience, you do kind of have to take into consideration that this book was also twice as expensive as a regular art book, which kind of left me wondering if this book had the exact same content but was shrunk down to the size of a normal art book and sort of all the bells and whistles were taken away, would it still be as good? And though I absolutely do think there would be a loss in the experience, I'm kind of wondering, well, if it's twice as expensive, is the book twice as good? I don't necessarily think twice as good, but it absolutely does lend an extra something to the experience. So on the whole, as a fan of these movies, this book left me a tiny bit underwhelmed, but as a fan of these sort of art books, this one is really impressive and really stands out in the sort of library and history of art and making of books.